Today, early access of Path of Exile 2 finally released, and I was able to reach mobs on my Stormweaver Sorceress in pretty much exactly 15 hours. So a lot of people have been asking me what build I am playing and what was I using early on. So today I want to give you a full Stormweaver leveling guide starting from Act 1 to mobs using my cast on Freeze Comet build. So far the build has been very fun and it's very easy to play. The way it works is you use Frostbolt, which pierces enemies, freezing them, and when enemies are frozen, the metagem called Cast on Freeze is triggered, which procs Comet, and comets just fall down the sky and obliterate everything on your screen. But of course you cannot start with the Comet, you can get it towards the end of Act 3. So first let's focus on how to play Sorceress before you get Comet, starting with Act 1. So in Act 1 most of the areas were pretty easy with maybe a few exceptions, but you shouldn't have too many issues as long as you're leveling your gems and checking vendor for the weapon. And by the way, this is one of the most important things. Every single time you level up, you should go to the vendor and type skill and maybe also rare if you want to, and check for the weapons. Because weapon is the most important upgrade, and what you want to look out for is +2 levels of skill gems depending on which skills you are using, and early on we are using Spark, so you should look out for +2 lightning skill gems. And if you want to use one-handed or two-handed, it doesn't really matter as long as you get more of it. That's good. Remember that if you're using one-handed weapon, you can also use focus, and on focus you also can get +2 skill gems. So if let's say you get staff two-handed with +2 skill gems, or you get a wand with +1 and focus with +1, it's basically the same thing, it doesn't matter too much. But let's talk about the skills. So what was I using in Act 1? So there is basically a trio that is just everyone is using pretty much. It is Spark, Flame Wall, and Frostbolt. So Spark is just your main damaging ability, you're just gonna cast it all the time. But if you use Flame Wall, the projectiles that pass through Flame Wall are dealing way more damage. It's actually very significant damage. It's very important to do it this way. And also, if you cast Flame Wall on boss is also gonna take additional ignite damage. And the third skill is Frostbomb. Frostbomb is just gonna detonate after a few seconds, and while it is on the ground, it is also applying exposure, the -2 cold resistance to enemies, but this one doesn't matter too much early on. You mostly care about the damaging ability. For the skills and supports, what I was using is Unleash. Unleash basically make it so every few seconds, here you can see the counter, so 2, it's gonna actually be used 3 times. But the first skill is gonna deal 100% damage, and then the second and third one is gonna do only 50% damage, which basically means it doubles damage of the Spark, as long as it says 2. So you use it, it's 0, now it's 1, now it's 2, and it's full again. So you basically every like 2 seconds, you have basically double damage. And the second support is Control Destruction, just for additional damage. So you're basically running around, casting Spark, then waiting a few seconds and casting again. But of course you don't have to wait, you can just cast constantly, it's still fine. Then Flame Wall, I was using this with Spell Cascade, just so that when you cast it, there are gonna be 2 more waves behind and in front. So that when, let's say, there are enemies here and you cast Flame Wall, but you are running away from them, very often what's gonna happen is Flame Wall is gonna be cast like here, and you're gonna have basically more opportunities to hit enemies. And the same thing if you are running after enemies, you're gonna move forward. Sometimes it's like kind of scuffed and it's being cast to the sides, but most of the time it's gonna be like this, so when you're gonna run forward, you're still gonna have another Flame Wall. And Frostbomb is most important on bosses. You can also use it for clear, but on bosses you always want to use it on cooldown. So let's say this is a boss, you always want to start with Frostbomb, Flame Wall, and just run around, cast Spark, and then Frostbomb on cooldown, recast your Flame Wall, Spark again, Frostbomb, just dodge around boss, Flame Wall, and basically that's your gameplay. Then later on, you can also add to your arsenal Orb of Storms. And it's basically kind of like Flame Wall, just short range. You want to use Frostbomb, Orb of Storm, Flame Wall, and again, just run around, Frostbomb. Just make sure to cast Frostbomb on cooldown, because when boss is frozen, you have more opportunity to just deal damage, you don't have to dodge ability, so freeze is just very OP. And yeah, that's basically your gameplay. And to be honest, you're gonna keep this setup for a very long time. what you can also do is when you are fighting bosses, you can swap the magnified effect on frost bomb to concentrate effect, and then on mapping you can swap back to magnified effect. And I also was using glaciation for more freeze buildup, so basically bosses are being frozen way faster. Orb of Storms, I didn't use any supports because, to be honest, I don't feel like I need to. But if you want to, you can use Arcane Tempo and maybe something like Overabundance, so you can use 2 Orb of Storms, but it's also a bit more annoying because you have to cast them more often and you have to cast them twice, so you're casting Spark less often, so it is a bit more annoying. I wouldn't do that. I would just go for Arcane Tempo if anything, and that's basically it. I actually don't even know if this works for Orb of Storm because Orb of Storm is casting it itself. Let me actually check it. I guess it increases the DPS. Yeah, it does work. Now, what about the passive skill tree? So what I would go for early on is go through this area, just get some spell damage, then go here, and actually don't take this, go here, take lightning damage, and then go here for these 2 points for just additional cast speed, and then go all the way to the left and take these additional damage when enemies are affected by ailments. So this is just a lot of damage because enemies are always going to be either chilled, shocked, or frozen. You're doing 3 different ailment types, so it's always going to happen. Just remember here early on you take lightning, and then eventually you're going to swap to cold. And this is the only swap we do in the entire build, just swapping from lightning to cold. Now in Act 2, I was still using the same setup, so Spark, Flame Wall, Frost Bomb, and Orb of Storms. I know that a lot of people are actually using some different setups, like for example, one of the more popular things is Arc. Arc is apparently pretty good. I haven't tested it because, to be honest, the moment I thought of actually trying it out, I was already thinking about swapping to cold, so I was thinking like, well, what's the point? And another option is Frostbolt with Ice Nova, because you can cast Ice Nova on Frostbolt, but Ice Nova actually doesn't do that much damage. It freezes enemies pretty easily, but it doesn't do that much damage, so I also didn't want to go for it. And one thing I have to say, it doesn't really matter what you're gonna end up doing. Act 2 is always going to be the hardest part of a campaign, in my opinion, at least for the Stormweaver. Who knows, maybe there is actually some kind of setup that people have still have not figured out, but for now it looks like people are just struggling in this act, and I also was struggling in here. So what's the point where you actually start swapping to the cold skills? So what I was doing is at the point where I was finally able to complete the trial, so trial of Sekema, I actually would delay it. I wouldn't do it at level 22, maybe go there at like level 27 or something like that, so somewhere towards the end of Act 2. So complete this trial. Then on top of that, you want to go all the way to the top on your tree and get this +1 to cold skills, and probably even inescapable cold for freeze buildup and glaciation for some cold exposure effect. Because when you get the Ascendancy, you're gonna get this point, Scouring Winds. This is gonna make your Frost Bomb apply additional -20 resistances. So normally it applies 20, with this it applies 40, and then thanks to the exposure effect, it applies even bigger -2 elemental resistances. And then you go to the left side here and you apply even more, so it's just crazy -2 resistances. But yes, to swap to cold skills, I would 100% recommend getting your Ascendancy, your first point, so the exposure, getting this Will, and being around level, I would say 27, maybe even higher. And the last piece of the puzzle is getting your skills. So what you want to do is you want to get Frostbolt and Cold Snap, I would say at least level 7 skill gems, so you will have to drop them or get them from quests. And you want to support Frostbolt with Scatter Shot, so you can shoot 3 Frostbolts instead of 1, and Glaciation, so you can freeze with Frostbolt more often. And Cold Snap you want to use with Spell Cascade, so it's being used 3 times instead of 1, and Concentrated Effect for more damage. And you still want to use Frost Bomb, but this time with Magnified Effect, and Control Destruction for a little bit more damage. And then eventually, once you get it, you also want to use Hypothermia for a little bit more extra damage. And the way your gameplay is gonna look at this point, you're gonna cast Frostbolt, and then you're gonna use Cold Snap on top of Frostbolt. And the way it works is Cold Snap has to be used either on Frostbolt or Frozen Enemy. When it's used on Frozen Enemy, it's gonna consume that freeze and deal damage, or it can be used on Frostbolt and then just detonate that Frostbolt, also dealing damage. And basically, just to show you, this is how it's gonna look like. You're gonna cast it and detonate, and that's basically it. So it's very simple gameplay. It's kinda small clear, I'm not gonna lie, it's not that amazing, but you're gonna freeze enemies more consistently than you were before, because previously you would do that only with Frost Bomb, and when there are some tougher enemies, you're gonna also use Frost Bomb, and then the same thing. And remember, Frost Bomb is applying exposure, because you have your Ascendancy, it's gonna be crazy amount of damage, so make sure your Frost Bomb is also always up when you are fighting tougher enemies. And I wouldn't expect anything crazy from this swap. It's just you want to swap to one type of element as fast as possible so that you have more things to go for on the tree. Like, for example, going for these cold nodes and these cold nodes. If you are a little bit of fire, a little bit of cold, a little bit of lightning, it's a little bit harder. So I would recommend just going for cold at this point immediately so that you just focus on cold. You don't have to worry about anything. And yes, it's not gonna be that amazing. You're probably gonna still struggle, especially with the last zone called the Dreadnought. Dreadnought is probably, in my opinion, the hardest area in the entire game. Like, enemies are just crazy. If you're gonna struggle, maybe try to get better weapon, maybe level up a little bit somewhere. You're probably just gonna die a lot. Try to clear it very slowly and then eventually fight the boss. And boss also is very hard. But if you are able to finish Act 2, you're finally gonna reach Act 3, and this is where the fun begins, because this is where we get Cast on Freeze. And to get it, you have to go to the Azak Bog and then kill the boss, the Ignadog, the Bog Witch, and you're gonna get 30 additional spirit, and you're also gonna get the Spirit Gem, which is gonna let you take the Cast on Freeze. And remember, when you get Cast on Freeze, you can put a skill in here. So we're gonna put Cold Snap, and we're gonna support it with Spell Echo, and you have to activate it. So you have to right click it, then it's gonna be activated, it's gonna work, you can deactivate it here and so on. It's just gonna consume 60 spirit. So like I said, we're gonna use it with Cold Snap and Spell Echo, so it's gonna be casted twice. So now you no longer have to use Cold Snap. Now you can just run around, spam Frostbolt, and when there are gonna be enemies, just to show you, the Cold Snap should be used automatically. Maybe I'm actually going to kill enemies here too fast, so maybe they are not even gonna get frozen. Unfortunately, I cannot find anything, kind of unlucky. Okay, here it is. And yeah, you can see these are being automatically detonated, so that's how it's gonna work. On top of that, you still use the Frost Bomb, so it's basically the same thing, magnified effect, but now you can use Strip Away, which is gonna increase the effectiveness of the exposure. On Frostbolt, still Glaciation with Scatter Shot. And another addition to our arsenal is Frostwall, which is we're gonna use with Spell Cascade and Icicle. So the way Frostwall works is you're going to use it and it's gonna spawn these crystals, and these crystals detonate after you deal enough damage to them. This is why you want to support it with Icicle, because Icicle make it so that they have less life, and also eventually on the tree you go for the Shatter Crystal, which is gonna make them have even less life. So this way they are easy to shatter and they're gonna deal damage around the crystals when, well, they are detonated. On top of that, when you spawn the Frostwall on some kind of big enemies, so for example, bosses, some of these crystals within the Frostwalls are gonna instantly detonate without even having to damage them, which is very, very good for bosses. And this is actually going to become your main bossing damaging ability. So the way you're gonna start the fight is you're gonna use Frost Bomb, then the Frostbite, after that Frostwall 3 times, because you can use it 3 times, and then just spam Frostbolt to just deal damage. But I actually would recommend remove Cast on Freeze, so deactivate it when you are fighting bosses, and just fight bosses with Frostwall and just regular Frostbolt. And that's basically it. And Frostbomb, just Frostbomb, Frostwall, Frostbolt without Cold Snap, because if you use Cold Snap, you're gonna remove Freeze from the bosses, which is actually kind of annoying. You want to use Frostwalls, and then if boss is still frozen, just wait for Frostwall cooldown, and you can just deal damage to boss again. And then towards the end of Act 3, when you're going to get skill gem level 11, you're finally going to get Comet. And at this point, swap is actually kind of simple. You just get Comet and remove the Cold Snap, and you put on Comet instead, and that's basically it. And now when you're gonna freeze something, Comet is gonna spawn instead of the Frostbite, instead of Cold Snap. So now you're just gonna do something like this, just to show you. Or some enemies again. We just freeze, and Comet is gonna just deal damage, and because you're supporting with Spell Echo, there's going to be 2 Comets every single time. But this is actually not that insane for bossing, because you're not freezing bosses too often, so you're still actually going to deal most of your damage to bosses with Frostwall. So your rotation is going to be on bosses, like on clear when you're going through maps, you're just gonna use Frostbomb. Occasionally Frostbomb, on where there is some big enemy, some rare or something, you can use Frostwall, but very rarely. Most of the time, you're gonna just use Frostbolt, but on bosses, you're gonna spawn the Frostbomb, Hypothermia, then walls 1, 2, 3, and then just spam Frostbolt. And this time you actually don't need to remove Cast on Freeze, because you actually want to spawn Comet, because Comets actually deal damage. Unlike the Cold Snap where it removes Freeze, the Comet does not remove Freeze, so it's actually pretty nice to have additional Comets. But what I also like to do is, at this point, once you get another level 11 skill gem, you can get second Comet. And what you can do is you can put it separately, and you can also cast it yourself. So not only you cast it on freeze, not only you use Frostwall, but when everything is on cooldown, you can also use Comet, and you can use Comet to actually destroy the crystals of the Frostwall. So what I supported with is the Hourglass, and then Inevitable critical, so that it becomes cooldown, but it deals more damage. Because you don't care that it's cooldown, you only use it from time to time anyway, mostly on bosses, so it's just a lot of damage. And because you are using it very rarely, you get basically 100% chance for it to be crit. And then eventually, when you get the lesser Jeweler Orb, which gives you additional sockets, and that's, by the way, how you get the additional sockets. You need a lesser Jeweler Orb, which drop from Act 2, very rarely, but they do drop. Eventually you get super critical once you get the level 3 support. You put it on the Comet, and that's basically your second Comet setup. And now finally, let me show you what I was using when I finished the campaign and reached the endgame. So again, cast on freeze with Comet, with concentrated effect, and Impetus. Impetus is pretty important because it actually allows you to use Comet every single time you freeze something. You need to combine it with 1 point of energy. If you don't have it, just Impetus itself is gonna give you 96, I believe, energy with every freeze, and you need 100. So you need just 1 point, you don't need any of these points. So you need to use it and get that 1 point, and this is basically perfect setup. For the second Comet, again, Hourglass, Inevitable Crit, and Super Critical. But later on, what I also added is third Comet, because you can never have enough Comets. So what Elemental Invocation does is every time you freeze, ignite, or shock, you get stacks of Elemental Invocation, and then you have button in here, and usually when I have 500 energy, which means you have 4 casts, you can use Comets, and it basically is casted 4 times. And you use a lot of mana. You have to actually spam a lot of mana flask when you're playing this build and stack some mana regen because it's mana heavy build, but it deals a crazy amount of damage. And the best thing about it is just it's very good for rares. So you have cast on freeze for just regular enemies. Whenever you encounter some kind of rare or some kind of tough enemy, you just use Elemental Invocation, and usually you just one-shot them. And you have Comet, additional one just for bosses. You can actually remove this one, but why not? I don't have really anything else I would be using at this point. So with Elemental Invocation, I'm using Comet with Spell Echo and with Capacitor, because it gives you more energy, so you can use more Comets at the same time. I decided to use Spell Echo here instead of the Cast on Freeze, because I actually didn't feel like I need more damage on Cast on Freeze. Most of the time, just single Comet would kill all of the regular packs, so I removed it. If you don't have that much damage, you can actually use Spell Echo here. And also for Elemental Invocation, you're gonna need some additional Spirit. And if you're wondering where do you get the last Spirit, you do get 30 Spirit from the Act 1 when you do the King of the Mist. Then you get additional 30 when you get the Cast on Freeze in the Act 3 at the Azak book. And then at the Act 3 on Cruel difficulty, again at the Azak Bog, when you kill the boss, you get additional 40 spirit, so you end up with 100. So if you want to use Cast on Freeze and Elemental Invocation, you need a little bit more energy, and I have it from the chest, which gives me 50, but it's actually easier to get it through the amulet. I actually dropped a few amulets with spirit at that point that are usable for this build. And I was actually thinking about doing it, but I have a good amulet with a lot of attributes, and you need a lot of dexterity if you want to use Elemental Invocation, so attributes are pretty good. For Frostbolt, still Scatter Shot with Glaciation, and I added Control Destruction just for more damage, so it's actually easier to freeze. And Frostbomb with Magnified Effect, Strip Away, and Considered Casting, just for a little bit more damage. And Frostwall with Spell Cascade, Icicle, and now Cold Mastery, just for a little bit more damage. It's actually not that amazing, but I'm running out of supports to use. I have no idea what I'm gonna use if I'm gonna have 5 or 6 links. Then Hypothermia with Persistence and Heightened Curse, just for a little bit more damage. And I'm also using, in my weapon swap, I'm using 2 one-handed hammers, and I'm using Leapstone just for a little bit of movement. It's nothing too crazy, but it also helps when you are stuck, when there's like a big pack of monster around you and you cannot move. It actually helps a lot. For my gear, I am using, actually the most important thing is using the flasks. You want to have as best flask as possible, so you can just recover your mana. Preferably you have prefix with increased amount of recovered. Suffix doesn't matter as much, but reduced charges per use is pretty good. And on your life flask, you want to have percentage of recovery is applied instantly. It also helps a lot when you are getting hit a lot. You just spam your life flask and yeah, you recover instantly your life. For a weapon, I actually got this towards the end of campaign. I got +6 to cold spell skills, then I regold critical strike chance, and then I exalted fire and cold damage. It's actually very, very good stuff. I would actually prefer to use one hand and focus at this point, because focus gives you energy shield, and I'm planning to swap to energy shield soon, but this is good for now. On helmet, just some life, attributes, resistances. Gloves, I actually want to remove them, but they give some freeze build-up. It's pretty good, but nothing too crazy, so yeah, I'm gonna remove them. Chest, again, just for the spirit, and reduce mana cost is also decent. Amulet for some attributes, spell damage, and a little bit of life. Rings, same thing, attributes, resist life, attributes, resist life, where here I have just resist. Boots, movement speed and resistances, these are actually pretty bad, but I'm using them for movement speed. And belt, again, life or attributes. That's basically all of the other items. For the charm, I actually swap them a lot depending on which zone I'm doing. If I notice that there's a lot of freezing enemies, I'm putting on the freezing charm. If I am getting stunned, I'm using this one, and so on and so on. Now, the biggest issue of this build is defense. Right now I do have 1.2k life, but I actually don't have almost any resistances. I have almost no armor. I'm actually dying quite a lot. So at this point, my biggest plan is going to be swap to energy shield. And speaking of energy shield, let me show you the final 3. So I talked about going for this cluster when you are around Act 2, because you want to swap to cold skills. And after you get these points, you want to go for exposure here and the climate change for some additional freeze buildup. And freeze buildup is very important because, of course, you want to freeze with single frostbolt preferably. And you get some additional damage against frozen enemies. Then after you get these points and the top 3, you want to start moving towards the right to get the shattered crystals, so that it's easier to shatter the frost wall. Then you don't want to go here yet, you want to go to the right and you want to take this energy node and then go for invocated efficiency, and after that you get the thin ice for some additional damage against frozen enemies and freeze buildup. You don't want to go for heavy frost because we don't need to penetrate ignore resistances because we are already applying exposure, so it doesn't matter that much. And then here, some mana regeneration is pretty good. And at this point, I start to go for energy shield because I want to swap to ES, so I went for these points. I needed some attributes, so I took these because I'm probably gonna go here. And these dexterity and intelligence and strength, you don't have to copy them exactly. Just take whatever you need. Remember, you can respec them, so if you need a bit of strength, change intelligence to strength, you need dex, change it to dex, and so on. It doesn't really matter what you go for. And yeah, that's basically the three. For the Ascendancy, the second one, I went for the Arcane Sword. I'm still scouring winds. And when I get the third one, I'm probably gonna go for Shaper of Storms and remove Arcane Sword. I'm wondering how my mana is gonna be looking like, but I guess we'll have to manage. So yeah, the build is pretty fun. That's what I did so far. My next step is going to be swap to energy shield so I don't die as much. Damage is pretty good, clear is pretty good, we only need defense. So once I reach that, hopefully build is gonna be very good. And if I figure out what I'm gonna do with it later on, I'm gonna make another video. So that's gonna be it for today and see you next time.